The sharp, double-toned chime of the booking system cut through the quiet of my office. My eyes went to the secondary monitor out of pure habit. The name flashed in crisp black letters against the white screen. Skylar Novak. Room selection, the Honeymoon Suite. Arrival this coming Saturday. Special requests included chilled champagne, a dozen white roses, and a late checkout on Sunday. I did not gasp. I did not slam my hands onto the reclaimed wood of my desk. Instead, the middle finger of my left hand tapped against the smooth surface. 1, 2, 3 times. The heavy scratched crystal of my mother's old Timex watch pressed into my wrist with the movement. The air in the small room behind the front desk smelled heavily of the lavender diffuser. I insisted on placing in every corner of the web my flagship 18-room boutique hotel in the Texas Hill Country. Right now, the scent felt thick enough to choke on. I clicked on the guest profile. It was the 4th reservation made under the name Skylar Novak at this property in the last 14 months. The first time she booked a room here was exactly 4 months ago. On the very same night, I pulled an anonymous photograph out of my post office box. I had spent hours that night pulling the security footage from the hallway cameras. I watched the screen show the same man walking beside her each time, my husband of 17 years, Mitchell Calloway. Mitch always came home on those Sunday nights, smelling faintly of expensive soap, and told me all about his exhausting weekend sales conferences in San Antonio. He had absolutely no idea that the luxury hotel he kept bringing his 20-something girlfriend to was owned entirely by the woman he left at home to cook his dinners. A soft knock sounded at the door before Hector stepped inside. My general manager wore his usual immaculate black vest and carried a small silver tray with a fresh cup of tea. He set it down next to my cold coffee, his dark eyes flicking toward the glowing monitor. He saw the name. I had told him about the situation 3 months ago, right after the second booking came through, Novak Hector said. His voice remained perfectly flat, offering no question, only a statement of fact. The Honeymoon Suite, this time I told him, my eyes never leaving the screen. Before this, it was always just a standard room. Champagne and white roses. Hector read from the request line, leaning slightly closer to the monitor. He is upgrading, I said, tapping my finger against the desk one more time, which means he is marking an occasion, an anniversary maybe, or something worse. Would you like me to cancel the reservation, miss? Webb, I finally looked up from the screen and met Hector's steady gaze. No, I want you to prepare an envelope. I pulled open the heavy bottom drawer of my desk. Inside sat a thick manila folder I had been adding to for 120 days. I reached in and pulled out 2 crisp sheets of paper. The first was a certified copy of my marriage certificate retrieved from the Travis County clerk, Mitchell Dean Calloway and Jolene Marie Webb. The second sheet was a copy of the commercial deed to this very building. It listed Calloway Hospitality LLC as the owner with Jolene Webb named as the sole proprietor. I slid both documents into a blank white envelope and pressed the flap down firmly. I picked up a black pen and wrote 2 words across the front in careful, deliberate cursive. Mr. Calloway. When they check in this Saturday, I said, holding the envelope out to Hector, you will hand this directly to the man. Do not explain anything. Do not answer any of his questions. You just hand it over and tell him it is a message from the owner's office. Hector took the envelope. He did not ask if I was sure. We had worked together for 17 years, and he knew exactly what it meant when my voice dropped to that quiet, hollow register. Decisions had been made. When the door clicked shut behind him, I looked at the silver-framed photograph of my mother sitting next to my keyboard. She died when I was 25, leaving behind a life insurance policy worth $180,000. Mitch had immediately suggested we use it to pay off the mortgage on our starter home. I told him the policy was only worth $30,000, handed him that exact amount, and quietly hid the rest in a separate account under my maiden name. It was the first real lie of my marriage, born out of a sudden, terrifying instinct for self-preservation. Over the next 17 years, I turned that hidden money into 3 boutique hotels, a real estate portfolio valued at $4.2 million. I built an empire in the shadows, while my husband told his friends I was a simple homemaker who liked to volunteer at bed and breakfasts to pass the time. Now he was renting a room I designed, sleeping on sheets I selected with a woman whose name he used to hide his tracks. I opened the second folder on my desk. The preliminary forensic accounting report from Bridget Hale. $67,000 in community marital funds drained to pay for this affair. Dinners, jewelry, cash withdrawals, and prepaid phones. I traced the line of numbers with my thumbnail. I had counted every single penny he stole from our family, and by the end of this week I was going to take every single one of them back. I picked up my cold coffee and took a slow sip. 4 months of planning. 4 days left. 5 days earlier I sat at Loretta Calloway's dining room table in Dripping Springs, suffocating in the heavy cloud of her white diamonds perfume. Sunday dinner was a mandatory weekly performance. The house boasted a facade of old money elegance, but the dining room rug was worn thin and the heavy drapes were fading at the edges. Loretta lived on her late husband's pension and Social Security, subtly relying on Mitch to pay her property taxes, though she would rather swallow glass than admit it to her country club friends. Loretta sat at the head of the table, her frosted blonde hair perfectly stiff, tapping her manicured nails against the stem of her wineglass. She spent the first 20 minutes asking Mitch about his sales numbers at the Ford dealership, her voice dripping with maternal pride. Then, as she always did, she turned her sights on me. "And how is your little motel project coming along, Joe?" Loretta asked. Her Texas drawl was sweet as honey, but the word motel was a sharpened blade. "It is still running," I answered, quietly keeping my eyes on my plate. "Well, bless your heart," Loretta said, her hand fluttering up to touch the gold cross resting against her collarbone. "I just will never understand why you enjoy cleaning up after strangers. But I suppose it keeps you busy while Mitchell works so hard to provide." From across the table, Mitch let out a loud, booming laugh. He cut a piece of roast chicken and shoved it into his mouth, completely ignoring the insult his mother just hurled at his wife. Beside him, my 16-year-old daughter Wren suddenly dropped her gaze to her lap, her shoulders pulling inward. My 13-year-old Cass pushed his chair back abruptly and asked to be excused to the bathroom, desperate to escape the tension settling over the room. Loretta took a delicate sip of her wine and shifted the conversation smoothly. "I spoke to Nina today. Her daughter Skylar just got a promotion at the winery over in Fredericksburg. She is doing so well. Such an independent, vibrant young woman. Not at all like these girls today who just cling to their husbands for an identity." I kept chewing my food, my face a carefully constructed mask of polite interest. But beneath the table, my hands curled into tight fists against my thighs. Skylar. The name echoed in my head, clicking perfectly into place with a memory from 4 months ago. The anonymous photograph that arrived in my post office box. Mitch standing in front of a familiar wooden cabin, his hand resting intimately on the lower back of a tall blonde woman. The cabin in the photograph belonged to Loretta. I looked at my husband, who was currently nodding along to his mother's praise of a woman he had been sleeping with for over a year. For 17 years I sat at this exact table and let Loretta treat me like dirt beneath her shoes. For 17 years Mitch never once raised his voice to defend me. I always thought he was simply afraid of his mother. But looking at his smiling face now, the truth crystallized in my mind with brutal clarity. He didn't defend me because he didn't think I was worth defending. He needed me to be small and insignificant so he could feel like a king. Late Tuesday evening, after the Honeymoon Suite booking came through, I drove into downtown Austin. The 14th floor office of Underwood & File smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. Kit Underwood sat behind a massive oak desk, the slanted evening sunlight cutting sharp lines across the floorboards. At 51, Kit wore a tailored navy blazer and no jewelry except a thin Cartier watch. She did not waste time with small talk. She was a high-asset divorce attorney, and I was paying her $600 an hour to dismantle my husband's life. I dropped the updated forensic report onto the center of her desk. The thick thud of the paper seemed to echo in the quiet room. "What did Bridget find in the new bank records?" Kit asked, opening the folder and scanning the top sheet. $67,400 in total. I told her, my voice steady. Commission checks from the dealership diverted into a personal account, then pulled out as cash every Friday. He used the cash to buy prepaid phones and to pay for rooms at a hotel over in Kerrville. That was before Skylar found my property on a booking app. Other hotels. Kit made a quick note on her legal pad. Before the web, 4 times in Kerrville, I confirmed. And then there is the cabin in Fredericksburg. Loretta's cabin, Mitch, has been paying the utilities and the maintenance fees for that cabin out of his commission account for the last year, I said. Which means he is using community marital funds to maintain the property he uses to cheat on me. Kit slowly lowered her pen and looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. Loretta knows. Loretta introduced them. I corrected the memory burning hot in the back of my mind. 14 months ago, at the Dripping Springs church picnic. Skylar is the daughter of her weekly bridge partner. Kit sat back in her chair, absorbing the information. "Jolene, you said the new booking at your hotel is for the Honeymoon Suite. He is escalating the behavior. What does that mean to you?" "It means it is time to end this," I said, folding my hands in my lap. "I want to file the divorce petition this Friday morning. I will have the envelope delivered to him at the check-in desk on Saturday afternoon. I want your process server waiting in the lobby to hand him the official court papers on Sunday morning, right before he checks out." Kit nodded slowly, her mind already working through the tactical timeline. "If we file first, we control the narrative. He is upgrading to a honeymoon suite, which means he might be planning something permanent with this girl. If he files first, he gets to choose the battleground." "He doesn't know I have a battleground," I replied. "That is your greatest advantage right now," Kit warned, leaning forward. "But Jolene, listen to me carefully. Under the Texas Family Code, property acquired by inheritance is separate property as long as it has never commingled with community funds. Your CPA has kept those LLC books spotless for 17 years. That $4.2 million belongs solely to you. But the moment Mitchell reads that deed, he is going to realize what he just lost. He will fight you for the house, the savings, and the kids. Loretta will try to fund a war against you. With what money?" I asked, a bitter smile touching the corner of my mouth. "She lives on a pension, and the taxes my husband pays for her out of our joint account." Kit let out a rare, quiet laugh. "All right then, let's talk about the disproportionate split." We spent the next hour reviewing the legal strategy. Because Texas allows for fault-based divorce, we were citing adultery. Between the hotel security footage, Bridget's forensic money trail, and the prepaid phone records, we easily met the preponderance of evidence standard. We would file a dissipation claim to force the court to credit the spent $67,000 back to my share of the community estate. I was aiming for 65% of our joint assets, plus primary custody of the children. "You have spent 4 months building an airtight fortress," Jolene Kit said, as she walked me to the heavy glass doors of her suite. "He has no idea the train has already left the station." I shook her hand and walked out into the carpeted hallway. When the elevator doors slid shut, I stood alone in the small metal box and stared at my reflection in the polished doors. I wore faded jeans, a plain white button-down shirt, and no makeup. The scratched Timex sat heavy on my wrist. For 17 years, Loretta looked at this exact reflection and saw a worthless motel girl. Mitch looked at it and saw a woman who only existed to wash his laundry. This Saturday, they were both going to see exactly what they had underestimated. The elevator chimed at the lobby level. I walked out into the warm Austin evening traffic, got into my car, and began the long drive back to Dripping Springs so I could make my husband a plate of chicken enchiladas. 4 months before that honeymoon suite booking came through, my entire reality shifted on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I pulled my car into the dusty parking lot of the Dripping Springs post office, following a routine I had maintained for 17 solid years. I opened that particular post office box the morning after my mother's funeral when I was 25 years old. At first, it served as a secure place to receive business mail for my newly formed limited liability company. Over time, that tiny metal box became the single piece of my existence that my husband knew absolutely nothing about. The post office smelled heavily of old paper and industrial floor wax. A ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, doing absolutely nothing to cut the stifling Texas heat, while the fluorescent lights buzzed a steady, irritating rhythm against the ceiling tiles. I turned my small brass key and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Most of it consisted of standard business mail, a tax form, a utility bill for one of the hotel properties. And then, sitting right at the bottom of the stack, I found a plain white envelope. It bore no return address. The postmark stamped across the corner read Fredericksburg. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a photograph printed on standard cheap printer paper. It was Mitch. He stood in front of a familiar wooden structure, leaning close to a younger blonde woman. His hand rested comfortably on the curve of her waist. They were both throwing their heads back in mid-laugh, captured in a moment of pure, unbothered joy. I walked out to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a very long time. I started the engine but did not shift the vehicle into gear. The air conditioning blasted cold air directly against my face, yet I could not feel the chill at all. I just stared at the photograph resting on my steering wheel. I recognized the wooden structure in the background immediately. It was Loretta's family cabin over in Fredericksburg, the exact spot where we held our summer barbecues every single year. I did not recognize the blonde woman, but my hands began to tremble. They shook with a strange, rapid vibration, exactly the way your fingers tremor after being submerged in freezing water for far too long. It was not shock. It was confirmation. Some deep, quiet part of me already knew the truth. The sudden increase in weekend sales conferences. The strange, sweet perfume lingering on his jacket collars when he tossed them into the laundry basket. The way he would smile down at his phone in the evenings and quickly place it face down on the coffee table the second I walked into the living room. I drove home, stood in my kitchen, and cooked a pot of roast beef and carrots. Mitch walked through the door right at 7 o'clock. He dropped his keys on the counter, pulled his phone from his pocket, and asked about my day without ever lifting his eyes from the glowing screen. I told him I did nothing special. That night, while he snored softly in our master bedroom, I sat at the kitchen island and opened my laptop. I logged into the security camera system for my second hotel property, the one that shared an overflow parking lot with Loretta's cabin area. I searched the video archives for the past 3 months. I found the footage from exactly 14 days prior. Mitch walking toward the cabin, the blonde woman walking right beside him. A week later, I sat alone in my primary office at the web, staring at 2 very different futures. I could choose the path of least resistance. I could drive home, throw that printed photograph onto the kitchen counter and scream until my throat bled. I knew exactly how that scenario would play out. Mitch would cry. He would fall to his knees, swear it was a meaningless mistake, and beg for my forgiveness. Loretta would immediately swoop in to protect her precious son, twisting the narrative until my emotional reaction became the real problem. They would call me hysterical. Mitch would use the chaos to quietly move our joint savings around, file for divorce on his own terms, and leave me fighting for scraps in a courtroom of his choosing. Or I could choose the second path. I could stay completely silent. I could hire a forensic accountant. I could retain a ruthless attorney. I could document every single dollar he spent on his betrayal, build an impenetrable fortress of evidence, and strike only when the blade was perfectly sharpened. The lavender scent from the corner diffuser suddenly reminded me of my mother. She spent 20 years scrubbing toilets and folding cheap linens at a roadside motel in Abilene. When my father walked out the door on my 6th birthday, she had absolutely nothing to her name. She had no secret savings, no lawyer, and no grand plan. She just had a crying child and an eviction notice taped to the front door. I remembered standing beside her when I was 10 years old, helping her stretch a fitted sheet over a lumpy mattress. She stopped, looked at me with deep, exhausted eyes, and gave me the only piece of financial advice I ever needed. "Count every penny, Jolene," she told me. "Men come and go. Money stays." I picked up my cell phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Bridget Hale was my college roommate at Texas State, and she now ran her own forensic accounting firm over in San Marcos. "Bridget," I said when she answered the line, "I need an audit. Entirely unofficial. Just between you and me for now." She did not ask me why. The flat, hollow tone of my voice gave her all the answers she needed. She simply asked for the account numbers to begin the trace. 7 days after that phone call, I walked into Kit Underwood's office in Austin for the very first time. 3 months ago, the real investigation began. Bridget called me late one Tuesday evening and asked me to run Mitchell's face through my security systems. I had installed advanced facial recognition software across all 3 of my properties the previous year to flag banned guests and known troublemakers. Bridget wanted to know if Mitch had ever brought his mistress anywhere near my territory. I honestly thought the request was a massive waste of time. Mitch had never once visited my hotels. He genuinely believed my hospitality business was an adorable little hobby, a cute project that kept his silly wife busy while he did the real work of selling pickup trucks. The office was completely dark, except for the single desk lamp casting a pale yellow circle over my keyboard. The security monitor glowed with a harsh blue light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My coffee had gone ice cold hours ago, but I took a sip anyway, needing the bitter caffeine to stay awake. Outside my window, the Texas crickets chirped a loud, relentless rhythm into the night air. Inside, the only sound was the quiet hum of my computer tower and the sharp click of my mouse as I dragged the video files into the search software. I uploaded the best picture I had of Mitch from my personal phone. I initiated the scan. A progress bar inched across the screen, searching 10 full months of archived footage from the main lobby of the web. The system pinged loudly in the quiet room. 3 separate matches found. My breathing stopped completely. I clicked on the very first match. The screen shifted to the main lobby camera. The timestamp read 10 months prior, a Friday evening at 6:47. The heavy glass doors of the web swung open, and Mitchell walked right into my hotel. He wore his favorite navy blue polo shirt and crisp khaki pants, the exact outfit he put on that morning before kissing my cheek and telling me he was heading to a regional zone conference. Walking right beside him was Skylar Novak. Her blonde hair fell over the shoulders of a floral sundress, and she was smiling up at him. Mitch placed his hand comfortably on her lower back, guiding her toward my reclaimed wood reception desk. I watched the evening desk clerk hand them a room key card. I watched Mitch and Skylar walk toward the elevators, their shoulders brushing together. They checked in under her name. I felt a massive, invisible weight strike the center of my chest, forcing the air out of my lungs. He came here. He brought another woman into the building I bought with my dead mother's money. He walked her across the lobby I designed, led her into a room I furnished, and slept with her on sheets I personally selected. And he had absolutely no idea. He was so incredibly blind to my existence, so profoundly uninterested in my daily life, that he did not even realize he was renting a room from his own wife. I opened the second video match. 7 months ago. The exact same pattern. Friday night check-in. Same standard room on the second floor. Room number 7. I opened the third match. 4 months ago. The exact same week the anonymous photograph arrived in my post office box. I reached for my phone with a hand that felt completely numb. I hit Bridget's contact name and waded through 2 agonizingly long rings. "Bridget," I said, my voice dropping so low it barely registered in the quiet office. 3 times. He brought her to my hotel 3 separate times. Which room did they take? Bridget shifted immediately into her clinical professional mode, the sound of her keyboard clacking rapidly through the speaker. "Standard room 7, I read the details straight from my booking system, monitor my eyes scanning the ledger. $189 a night, plus room service charges, minibar fees, and late checkout penalties." "What is the total damage for those 3 specific visits?" Bridget asked. $2,340 just for my property. I calculated the math in my head, the numbers clicking into place with cold precision. That does not even include the other hotels in Kerrville, or the utilities at Loretta's cabin. A heavy silence stretched over the phone line for several seconds. When Bridget finally spoke, her tone was deadly serious. "Joe, how exactly did he pay for these rooms?" "Cash," I answered, gripping the edge of my desk. "Every single time." "And where did that cash come from?" "I have a feeling you are going to find out," I told her. I ended the call and closed my laptop, plunging the office into deeper shadows. I picked up the silver-framed photograph of my mother. In the picture, she stood in front of that miserable roadside motel in Abilene, holding a ring of brass room keys, smiling with a bone-deep exhaustion that I finally understood. She spent her entire adult life cleaning up other people's messes. She had no forensic accountant. She had no aggressive Austin attorney to fight her battles. She had no multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio to fall back on when the world collapsed around her. She only had a small life insurance policy and a daughter she hoped would do better. I had everything. I had the money, the hard evidence, and the infinite patience required to burn his entire world to ash. Early the next morning, I stood in my kitchen and dialed Kit Underwood. "I am ready," I told the lawyer, while the morning coffee brewed and the Texas sun crested over the horizon. "I have the proof, but we are not filing the petition yet. I want to wait 3 more months. "What exactly are we waiting for?" Kit asked, the rustle of legal pads echoing through the receiver. "I want to give him enough time," I said, watching the dark liquid fill my ceramic mug. "I want to let him hang himself with his own rope." Exactly 1 week after I decided to let my husband build his own trap, I found myself sitting at my mother-in-law's dining room table in Dripping Springs. The Sunday dinner performance had always been a weekly requirement, an exhausted tradition of dry roast beef and veiled insults. But that evening, the heavy air in Loretta's house felt completely different to me. I was no longer just the quiet wife absorbing her passive aggression. I was a collector, and every word that fell from her mouth was a piece of data. Loretta sat at the head of the table, her frosted hair catching the warm glow of the chandelier. The overwhelming scent of her white diamonds perfume masked the smell of the gravy sitting in the center of the table. She picked up her wine glass, her manicured fingers tapping against the crystal stem, and smiled brightly at her son. "Mitchell took me to the Cabernet Grill last Thursday," Loretta announced, looking around the table as if waiting for applause. "My boy certainly knows how to treat his mother to a proper evening out." I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a small piece of carrots, but my mind instantly filed the information away. Cabernet Grill was a high-end restaurant over in Fredericksburg. A dinner for 2 easily ran over $200. My husband paid for that meal with a credit card tied to our joint marital account. "It was nothing," Mama Mitch said, flashing that wide salesman smile of his. He reached for a dinner roll and tore it in half. "You deserve a nice night out." "Well, it was lovely." She continued, taking a delicate sip of her wine. She set the glass down and folded her hands over her pristine white napkin. "Oh, and I spoke to Nina earlier today. Her daughter Skylar just got promoted at the winery. She is planning all their major events now. It is just so wonderful to see a young woman building a real career for herself." Loretta let the silence hang for a split second, giving the insult just enough time to breathe before she turned her sharp gaze toward me. She smiled, though the expression never reached her cold eyes. "Not everyone has the drive for that kind of professional success," she added sweetly. I did not flinch. I did not bite my tongue. I simply noted the fact that Loretta was actively maintaining a connection with the woman my husband was sleeping with, bringing her name up at the family dinner table right in front of my face. She was testing the waters, rubbing her little secret right into the wood of her dining table. "By the way," Mitch spoke up, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I have a regional zone conference in Houston coming up next weekend. I will need to be gone for 3 days. The dealership wants me to cover the new inventory expansion." I took a slow sip of my iced tea. Houston, 3 days. I made a mental note to cross-reference his travel dates with Skylar's work schedule at the winery. Later that night, the heavy doors of Mitch's truck slammed shut, sealing us inside the dark cabin. The engine rumbled to life, and the dashboard illuminated his face in a pale green glow. The drive back to our house usually passed in complete silence, but the tension from the dinner table still hovered in the confined space. Mitch kept his hands draped casually over the leather steering wheel. He glanced over at me while we waited at a red light. "My mother seemed to be in a good mood tonight," he said, his voice hesitant, searching for a specific reaction. "She did not say anything that upset you, did she?" "No," I answered, keeping my voice perfectly level. "She seemed very happy." I heard the quiet rush of air escape his lungs. He was incredibly relieved. He desperately wanted his mother and his wife to maintain a peaceful illusion, mostly because a quiet house allowed him to slip away without answering any difficult questions. He wanted to avoid choosing a side. I turned my head and studied his profile in the dark. The streetlights washed over his jawline as we drove down the empty highway. For 17 years, I loved the face sitting next to me. I washed his clothes, cooked his meals, and believed we were building a life together. Now sitting in the passenger seat, I realized he had absolutely no idea who was actually riding in the car with him. He thought I was just sitting there because I had nowhere else to go. He could not fathom that I was choosing to stay, remaining perfectly still in the dark, gathering enough rope until the exact moment I decided to pull it tight. 2.5 months before the Honeymoon Suite booking, I parked my car in front of a small brick building in San Marcos. The brass plaque on the door read, "Bridget Hale Certified Fraud Examiner." The office inside was completely spotless. The walls held framed credentials and small pictures of her 2 children, while the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon cleaner. Bridget sat behind a neat glass desk. She wore her red hair cut in a sharp bob and pushed a pair of dark-framed glasses up the bridge of her nose. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She slid a thick 14-page report across the glass surface. "The total damage is $67,400, Bridget said, her voice entirely professional. She tapped a silver pen against the top page. "That is the amount he spent over the last 14 months. I stared at the black numbers printed on the crisp white paper. The room was perfectly silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning vent above our heads. "Break it down for me," I said. Bridget opened the file and flipped to the second page. $18,200 went to hotel rooms. We found 4 separate weekend stays at a resort in Kerrville, 3 visits to your property at the Webb, and 2 other locations closer to Austin. She turned another page, her pen hovering over a list of itemized charges. $12,600 on jewelry and gifts. He favored Kendra Scott and James Avery. Not incredibly high-end pieces, but the purchases were consistent. Almost every single month, I placed my hands flat on my lap. I had not received a piece of jewelry from my husband in 5 years. $9,800 on restaurants, Bridget continued, her eyes scanning the columns. There is a very clear pattern here. Every Friday night that he claimed to be at a sales conference, a charge appeared at a high-end steakhouse or a seafood restaurant. "What about the phones?" I asked, remembering the cash withdrawals she mentioned during our very first phone call. $7,200, Bridget confirmed. He purchased 2 separate prepaid phones over the 14-month period. He swapped the hardware out every 7 months, but the plan was funded by regular cash withdrawals from the dealership account. Bridget paused and looked up at me. She turned to the final section of the report. "This part is the most interesting. $8,400 went toward utilities and maintenance fees for a property he does not own. The cabin in Fredericksburg." "Loretta's cabin," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He has been paying her electric bills, the water, and the quarterly landscaping fees directly from his commission account," Bridget explained. "All of those funds are considered community property under Texas law. He has no separate inheritance or trust to draw from." His commission checks are the only source of income he generates, which means every single dollar he spent on those bills belonged to your marriage. I reached out and pulled the report closer to my side of the desk. I turned to the page detailing the cabin expenses. Does Loretta know he is paying her utility bills with community funds? Loretta likely does not care what the legal definition of community property is, Bridget said quietly. But you do. And the family court judge certainly will. I looked at the final total again. $67,400. That specific number represented a full third of my husband's income over the last year. He had literally burned a third of our family resources to maintain a secret life with a younger woman. While I spent the last 17 years quietly saving, reinvesting my inheritance, and building a secure future, he was draining our joint accounts to buy cheap necklaces and hotel rooms. Compared to the $4.2 million sitting safely in my separate business portfolio, his secret spending was just a drop in the ocean. It was practically nothing to me financially. But to Mitchell, that money was absolutely everything he had to show for his hard work. I thanked Bridget, took the heavy folder, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The heat radiated off the asphalt parking lot, pressing heavily against my shoulders. The sheer specificity of the betrayal was what anchored the coldness deep in my chest. He did not just make a singular mistake. He made thousands of tiny, deliberate choices. Every ATM withdrawal, every restaurant receipt, and every electric bill paid for his mother's cabin was a decision to steal from his own family. 2 months before the final confrontation, I stood at the kitchen island in Dripping Springs, browning ground beef in a heavy iron skillet. The smell of onions and garlic filled the warm space. My 16-year-old daughter, Wren, sat on one of the tall wooden bar stools across from me. Her laptop was open, supposedly displaying her history assignment, but I could clearly see the screen reflecting against the dark window glass. She was reading a Wikipedia article about something entirely unrelated to school. Wren had been incredibly quiet for the past few weeks. She usually filled the kitchen with stories about her friends or complaints about her teachers, but lately she just sat in silence, her dark eyes staring blankly at the marble counter. "Are you doing okay today?" I asked, stirring the meat with a wooden spoon. "Fine," Wren answered automatically. She did not bother to look up from her glowing screen. Before I could press the issue, the front door banged open. My 13-year-old son Cass rushed into the kitchen like a sudden storm. He dropped his heavy backpack onto the floor, pulled open the refrigerator door, and grabbed a handful of cheese sticks. "Coach Draper gave me an A on my essay," Cass announced loudly, kicking the refrigerator door shut with his heel. His energy bounced off the walls loud and completely normal. Wren did not even blink. She remained perfectly still, her shoulders hunched forward, isolating herself from the noise of the room. I watched her carefully. I noticed the subtle shift in her behavior weeks ago, specifically whenever Mitchell walked into a room. When her father tried to joke with her, she offered only single-syllable answers. When he asked about her day, she would suddenly remember a chore she needed to finish upstairs. Mitch never noticed the coldness. He was far too wrapped up in his own manufactured reality to see the massive distance growing between him and his oldest child. I initially attributed her silence to typical teenage moodiness. 16 was a difficult age, full of shifting hormones and sudden frustrations. But as I watched her stare at the blank counter, a heavy unease settled in the pit of my stomach. Wren looked so much like me. She had the same dark brown eyes, the same brown hair, and the exact same habit of pulling her shoulders inward when she was carrying a heavy thought. I wondered just for a fleeting second if she knew something. It seemed entirely impossible. I had been incredibly careful with my investigation. I kept the folders locked away, I made my phone calls from the hotel office, and I never let the mask slip when Mitch was around. But Wren was fiercely observant. When she finally lifted her head and looked toward the hallway where her father's boots sat by the door, the expression on her face was not teenage anger. It was deep, profound disappointment, the specific kind of absolute letdown that a child should never have to feel toward a parent. I turned back to the hot skillet, pushing the heavy thoughts away. I could not afford to lose my focus now. I had a timeline to keep evidence to secure, and a massive empire to protect. Whatever shadow was hanging over my daughter, I promised myself I would clear the skies the moment the divorce papers were finally signed. That shadow hanging over my daughter haunted me long after I finished cooking dinner that evening, but I forced myself to compartmentalize the ache in my chest. I had to keep my focus entirely on the quiet, methodical work of dismantling my husband's secret life. Later that same week, exactly 2 months before I planned to deliver the white envelope across the hotel reception desk, I sat in my office at the web and opened a completely different set of security files. My second property was a smaller boutique inn located just outside the Fredericksburg city limits. I purchased it 5 years ago specifically because it sat nestled against a beautiful stretch of the Texas Hill Country. By pure coincidence, the western edge of my hotel parking lot shared a property line with the gravel access road leading directly to Loretta's family cabin. When I upgraded the security systems at all my properties the previous year, I made sure the high-definition cameras covered every single angle of my parking lots, including the perimeter fences. I sat back in my desk chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. I pulled up the archived footage from the camera pointing toward that western boundary. I specifically searched the dates Bridget highlighted in her financial report, the weekends where Mitch had paid for the cabin utilities using his commission account. I clicked play on a file dated 6 months prior. The screen showed a crisp, wide-angle view of the gravel road. The timestamp in the upper right corner ticked forward in bright white numbers. It was a Friday afternoon, right around 3 o'clock. The Texas sun cast long, sharp shadows across the dirt. A vehicle rolled slowly into the frame. It was not a Ford pickup truck. It was a massive beige Lincoln Town Car. I leaned forward, my face inches from the glowing monitor. I knew that car intimately. I had washed it in my own driveway on countless Sunday afternoons just to keep the peace. The Lincoln pulled to a stop in front of the wooden cabin. The driver's side door opened and Loretta stepped out. She wore a tailored floral church dress, her frosted blonde hair perfectly sprayed into place, completely immune to the afternoon breeze. I watched my mother-in-law walk up the wooden steps to the cabin porch. She reached into her leather handbag, pulled out a set of brass keys, and unlocked the heavy front door. She stepped inside for exactly 4 minutes. When she emerged, the yellow glow of the porch light clicked on, illuminating the shaded entryway. She carefully placed a spare key squarely in the center of the wrought iron patio table. She smoothed her skirt, walked back to her beige Lincoln, and drove away, leaving a faint cloud of white dust in her wake. I fast-forwarded the video file exactly 30 minutes. Mitchell's truck pulled onto the gravel road. Skylar sat in the passenger seat. Mitch walked up the steps, grabbed the spare key his mother had just left for him, and opened the door. My stomach plummeted, a cold, heavy stone dropping directly into my gut. I opened a second video file from 2 months later. The exact same pattern played out on the screen. The beige Lincoln arrived. Loretta unlocked the door. The porch light went on. The key was left on the table. The mother drove away so the son could arrive with his mistress. I opened a third file. The identical sequence repeated. Loretta was not simply turning a blind eye to her son's infidelity. She was not just passively hoping her son would find a way out of a marriage she openly despised. She was actively managing the logistics. She was running a private illicit bed and breakfast to facilitate the destruction of my family. She was fluffing the pillows and leaving the lights on for the woman she wanted to replace me. I reached for my cell phone and dialed my attorney. Kit answered on the second ring, the sound of legal papers shuffling in the background. "Kit," I said, my voice tight and vibrating with a sudden sharp anger. I was just reviewing the camera footage from my second property. The perimeter cameras caught Loretta's car at the family cabin 3 separate times over the last 6 months. She arrives exactly 30 minutes before Mitchell and Skylar show up. The line went completely silent for 5 long seconds. The shuffling of papers stopped. Is she preparing the cabin? She unlocks the door. I told her, my eyes still glued to the paused image of Loretta on my monitor. She turns on the exterior lights. She leaves a spare key right on the patio table. Then she drives away before they arrive. "Jolene, listen to me," Kit said, her tone dropping into a fierce clinical register. "This shifts the entire landscape. This is not a mother simply knowing about a mistake. This means she is an active participant in the dissipation of your marital assets." "That is exactly why I called you," I replied, pressing my fingers against my throbbing temples. "When we finally file this petition," Kit explained, the strategic wheels clearly turning in her head, "Loretta is going to be slapped with a subpoena. She is going to be forced into a deposition room. She will have to sit across a table from me and testify under oath." "She will lie," I said immediately. "She has spent her entire life lying to protect her image." "She might try," Kit agreed smoothly, "but we will have the video footage sitting right in front of us. And you need to remember that perjury in the state of Texas is a Class A misdemeanor. She will hang herself the moment she opens her mouth." I ended the call and stared blindly at the dark monitor. For 17 long years, Loretta had called me the motel girl. She treated me like a stray dog her son had foolishly brought into her pristine home. And for all those years, she had been quietly searching for my replacement. Skylar was young, blonde, and came from what Loretta considered a proper family. I finally understood the absolute depth of her hatred. Loretta did not hate me because I was a bad wife. She hated me because my working-class background reminded her of her own deeply buried insecurities. She spent 40 years pretending to be old money, and she was terrified that my presence in her family exposed the fragile, pathetic reality of her performance. 6 weeks before the check-in date, I sat in the small spare bedroom of our Dripping Springs house. Mitch thought I used the quiet space to read romance novels and fold laundry. He had never once bothered to look inside the locked bottom drawer of the small wooden desk tucked into the corner. It was past midnight. The house was completely silent, the kind of deep, heavy quiet that only happens when everyone else is fast asleep. A single desk lamp provided a small pool of yellow light. I spread a massive sheet of heavy drafting paper across the surface of the desk. I picked up a thick black marker. The sharp smell of the ink filled my senses as I began to draw a horizontal line straight across the center of the page. I was building a master timeline connecting every single data point Bridget and I had uncovered over the last few months. I made a heavy black mark on the far right side of the paper. 4 months ago, the arrival of the anonymous photograph in my post office box. I moved my hand to the left. 5 months ago, Earl Jessup Loretta's loyal handyman of 11 years was abruptly fired for taking leftover food from her refrigerator. I moved further left. 10 months ago, the very first time Skylar booked a room at the Webb using her own name. 14 months ago. The very first time Mitch used cash to pay for a room at the resort in Kerrville. I stopped. I stared at the timeline, the black marks standing out starkly against the white paper. 14 months of active betrayal. But where did it actually begin? How did a married man who spent his entire life selling trucks in the suburbs suddenly cross paths with a young event coordinator from a Fredericksburg winery? My mind began to drift backwards, sifting through the chaotic memories of family gatherings, holiday parties, and neighborhood barbecues. And then, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room, a specific memory locked into place. 16 months ago, the annual spring picnic at the Dripping Springs Community Church. The memory washed over me with a sickening clarity. It had been a brutally hot Sunday afternoon. The air felt thick with humidity, and the heavy, sweet smell of smoked brisket and barbecue sauce. Loretta, as a senior member of the congregation, had claimed a seat at the shaded VIP tables under the large oak trees, sipping sweet tea with the pastor's wife. Meanwhile, she had loudly volunteered my services for the kitchen cleanup crew, effectively banishing me to the sweltering church basement. I remembered standing in front of the massive stainless steel sinks, my hands submerged in scalding soapy water, scrubbing baked beans off heavy aluminum serving trays. The heat in the kitchen was absolutely suffocating. Sweat dripped down the back of my neck. I paused to wipe my forehead with the back of my wrist, glancing out the small rectangular window situated just above the sink. The window offered a clear view of the grassy lawn. I saw Mitchell standing near the dessert tables. He was holding a paper plate, flashing his bright, charming smile at a tall blonde woman in a floral dress. And standing directly between them with her hand resting proudly on the younger woman's shoulder was Loretta. Loretta was talking, gesturing between her son and the blonde woman. She was making an introduction. I sat completely frozen in my home office, the black marker suspended above the drafting paper. 16 months ago. 2 full months before the very first hotel receipt appeared in Bridget's forensic audit. Loretta did not just enable the affair. She initiated it. She had found the daughter of her wealthy bridge partner, recognized an opportunity, and actively pushed her own married son right into the girl's path. While I was standing in a boiling kitchen washing dishes with blistered hands to maintain the family reputation, my mother-in-law was standing in the cool shade, actively shopping for my replacement. I pressed the tip of the black marker against the far left edge of the paper. 16 months ago, the church picnic. The exact moment the entire plan was born. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage rolled through my body so powerful it made my vision blur at the edges. It was not the chaotic screaming kind of anger. It was a cold, absolute fury. I stared at the timeline, at the meticulously plotted points of my own destruction, and I made a silent vow to the empty room. 16 months ago, I washed their dirty dishes. 16 months from now, I would own the very table they sat at. 5 weeks before the final confrontation, I found myself sitting alone in my office at the Webb once again. The late-night hours had become my only true sanctuary. The hotel was incredibly quiet, the silence broken only by the faint, distant hum of the commercial ice machine down the carpeted hallway. The signature scent of lavender felt heavier tonight, soothing the sharp edges of my exhaustion. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the silver-framed photograph sitting on my desk. My mother stared back at me, standing in front of that miserable roadside motel in Abilene. She looked so incredibly tired in the picture. Her shoulders slumped beneath her cheap uniform, but a small, proud smile played at the corners of her mouth. I was exactly 8 years old in the photograph, standing right beside her, my arms wrapped tightly around a massive stack of freshly laundered bedsheets. I reached out and touched the scratched crystal of the Timex watch strapped to my left wrist. It was the exact same watch my mother wore in the photograph. She left me $180,000, I whispered out loud, my voice rough and cracking in the empty room. I had never spoken the exact amount out loud to another living soul. For 17 years, I carried the weight of that lie entirely on my own shoulders. I lied to him, Mom, I continued, speaking to the frozen image behind the glass. I looked him right in the eyes, and I told him it was only $30,000. I kept $150,000 completely hidden. I used it to buy this ruined building. I renovated every single room with my own 2 hands. I named it The Web After You. I took a shaky breath, the lavender scent filling my lungs. I did all of it completely alone, because not a single person in that family ever bothered to ask me what I was doing. Mitch truly believed I was just making beds for strangers. Loretta genuinely thought I was playing house. And for the longest time, I convinced myself that I hid the money because I was simply afraid. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, my eyes locked on my mother's tired smile. But that was not the truth, I whispered. I did not hide it out of fear. I hid it because I knew deep down in my bones that if Mitchell found out about the money, he would try to control every single cent of it. He would have drowned your life savings in mortgage payments and practical truck upgrades. This money, this business, it was the only thing in the world that belonged entirely to me. To us. It was not a deception. It was armor. I reached out and gently closed the leather-bound ledger sitting next to her picture. I turned off the small desk lamp, plunging the office into darkness. I walked out the back staff entrance, locked the heavy metal door, and drove my car back toward Dripping Springs. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house was completely dark. Mitch was sound asleep in the master bedroom, dead to the world. Cass was snoring softly in his room at the end of the hall. I walked quietly up the carpeted stairs, my steps entirely silent. As I passed down the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. A thin, sharp sliver of yellow light glowed from beneath the door to Wren's bedroom. It was nearly 2 in the morning. She should have been asleep hours ago. I stood outside her door for a very long time. My hand hovered inches from the wooden frame, desperate to knock. I wanted to open the door, sit on the edge of her bed, and pull her into my arms. I wanted to tell her that I saw the heavy sadness weighing her down, that I knew she was carrying a terrible secret, and that she did not have to protect our broken family anymore. But I slowly lowered my hand. I could not bring her into the chaos yet. If I said anything now, if I gave her even a piece of the truth, it could unravel 4 months of meticulous surgical planning. I had to let her carry the burden for just a few more weeks. I pressed my palm flat against the wood of her bedroom door, offering a silent, invisible promise into the quiet hallway. I would make it right. I would tear the entire house down to the foundation, and then I would build her something real to stand on. I turned away from the light, walked into the dark master bedroom, and lay down next to the man who was about to lose absolutely everything. That Friday morning began exactly like any other day in my 17-year marriage. I woke up long before the sun crested over the hills, stood in my kitchen, and packed 2 school lunches while my husband slept upstairs. But when the clock struck 8, I did not stay home to fold the laundry. I got into my car and drove straight into downtown Austin. The Travis County Courthouse smelled aggressively of industrial cleaning solution and ancient dusty paper. My flat shoes clicked a steady rhythm against the highly polished marble floors as I walked down the wide corridor. I wore a crisp white button-down shirt and a pair of clean denim jeans. I clutched a thick manila folder tightly against my chest. The heavy crystal of my mother's Timex watch pressed against my skin with every step. Kit Underwood waited for me right outside the clerk's office. She looked perfectly in her element, wearing a sharp charcoal suit and holding a stack of legally binding documents. We stood together near a massive stone pillar, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing quietly above our heads. Kit opened the master folder and ran her manicured finger down the edge of the organized pages, offering me one final review before the strike. The first section contained the official petition for divorce. We were filing under the specific statutes of the Texas Family Code that allowed for a fault-based dissolution of marriage, citing adultery. The second section held the absolute most important piece of paper I possessed, the affidavit of separate property. It legally established that Callaway Hospitality and all 3 of its hotel properties were funded entirely by my separate inheritance, managed under my maiden name. and had never once been commingled with community marital funds. The third section contained a motion for a temporary restraining order, a standard legal maneuver designed to completely freeze all of Mitchell's bank accounts so he could not suddenly drain our joint savings the moment he realized he was being served. The fourth section was Bridget Hale's masterpiece, the dissipation claim. It demanded that the court credit the $67,400 Mitch spent on his affair directly back into my share of the community property. The final two sections were discovery requests for the dealership financial records and a direct subpoena demanding Loretta Calloway appear for a sworn deposition regarding her involvement with the cabin. Jolene Kit said quietly, her eyes locking onto mine. The moment you sign this page, we cross the point of no return. You cannot put this fire out once you strike the match. He is going to find out. And when he realizes you have been hiding $4.2 million, his reaction is going to be incredibly volatile. I have been ready for this moment for 4 solid months, I told her, keeping my voice completely even. I am only waiting for him to walk into my lobby tomorrow afternoon. Kit handed me a heavy silver pen. I pressed the tip against the thick paper and signed my full legal name. The clerk behind the glass window took the document, stamped it with a loud final thud, and filed it into the public record. It was exactly 47 minutes past 10 in the morning. I walked out of the courthouse, stepping into the bright Austin sunlight and the chaotic noise of the morning traffic. The marriage was officially over on paper. My hands trembled for the very first time in 120 days. It was just a brief involuntary flutter of my fingers, a sudden release of the massive pressure I had been carrying. I looked down at my watch. I had exactly 28 hours left until my husband checked into the honeymoon suite. The next afternoon, I sat completely alone in my private office behind the front desk of the Webb in Fredericksburg. The heavy wooden door was locked from the inside. I had 2 large monitors glowing brightly on my desk. The left screen displayed the live feed from the main lobby camera. The right screen showed the camera positioned at the end of the second-floor hallway. A fresh mug of hot black coffee sat perfectly centered on my desk pad. Steam curled into the air, mixing with the signature lavender scent pumping from the corner diffuser. I placed both of my hands flat against the wooden surface of the desk. My fingers were entirely still. They did not shake. The only sound in the room was the relentless, rhythmic ticking of the watch on my left wrist. On the left, monitor the afternoon sun spilled across the lobby floorboards. The front desk, built from reclaimed wood I had personally selected from an old barn in Bourne, gleamed under the warm lighting. A massive crystal vase full of fresh bluebonnets and wildflowers sat perfectly positioned at the corner of the counter. Hector stood behind the desk in his immaculate black vest, reviewing his computer screen, with absolute practiced calm. A plain white envelope rested on the shelf directly beneath the counter, hidden from public view, but sitting perfectly within Hector's reach. At 12 minutes past 4, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. Mitch walked into my hotel. He wore his favorite navy blue polo shirt and crisp khaki pants. He pulled a small leather overnight suitcase behind him, his posture completely relaxed and radiating a loud, easy confidence. He was smiling broadly, a man entirely comfortable in a space he believed he knew. He knew where the elevators were located. He knew the layout of the lobby. He just did not know who actually owned the floor he was walking on. Skylar walked right beside him. She wore a bright floral dress and carried a brown leather weekend bag over her shoulder. She was laughing at something he had just said. Mitch reached out and placed his hand affectionately against the small of her back, guiding her directly toward the front desk. I leaned closer to my monitor, my chest tightening with anticipation. I could not hear their voices through the security feed, but I had rehearsed this exact interaction with Hector 3 times before I locked myself in the back office. Hector looked up from his computer and offered them his standard professional smile. He asked for the name on the reservation. Skylar stepped forward and leaned against the reclaimed wood counter. I watched her lips move as she gave him her name. Hector typed the information into the system. I knew exactly what he was saying to them. He was confirming the honeymoon suite. He was confirming the 2-night stay, the late checkout request, and assuring them that the chilled champagne and the white roses were already waiting for them in the room. Skylar turned her head and smiled brilliantly at Mitch. She placed her hand lightly on his arm. Mitch grinned back at her, puffing his chest out just a fraction, playing the role of the generous provider, treating his beautiful girlfriend to a luxurious weekend getaway. Hector programmed a plastic key card and slid it across the wooden counter. Skylar picked it up. Then Hector reached beneath the counter. He pulled out the crisp white envelope and held it out not to Skylar, but directly toward Mitchell. I watched my husband's broad smile falter for a split second. He pointed at his own chest, clearly asking a question. Hector simply nodded, his expression completely neutral, and kept the envelope suspended in the air between them. Mitch took the envelope. He frowned, turning it over in his hands. He looked at Skylar, gave a small shrug of his shoulders, and ripped the sealed flap open. He pulled out the folded pages. He unfolded the first document. It was the certified copy of our marriage certificate. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the page. I saw the exact second his brain registered the names printed on the official state document: Mitchell Dean Calloway and Jolene Marie Webb. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stopped breathing. He quickly shuffled the paper to the back and stared at the second document: the commercial deed to Calloway Hospitality. The legal paper naming Jolene Marie Webb as the sole and exclusive proprietor of the very building he was currently standing inside. Mitch looked up. His eyes were wide and frantic. He looked at the reclaimed wood of the front desk. He looked at the vase of fresh bluebonnets. He looked at the framed landscape photographs hanging on the lobby walls, the exact same photographs I had proudly shown him years ago when I claimed I was just doing a favor for a friend who owned a bed and breakfast. He looked at Hector. Hector did not say a single word. My general manager simply offered a polite, incredibly tight smile and took one deliberate step backward, folding his hands behind his back. Skylar reached out and touched Mitchell's arm, clearly asking him what was wrong. Mitch flinched violently, pulling his arm away from her touch, as if she had suddenly burned him. The papers slipped from his trembling hands and fluttered down to the hardwood floor. He ignored them. He ignored her. He desperately shoved his hand into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. Inside my dark office, the cell phone sitting perfectly flat on my desk instantly lit up. The screen flashed bright white. Mitchell calling. I let it ring. The sound vibrated against the wood. I did not move a single muscle. I watched the monitor as Mitch paced in a tight, frantic circle near the entrance of the lobby, holding his phone against his ear. The call went to my voicemail. He immediately pulled the phone away, stabbed the screen with his thumb, and brought it right back to his ear. My phone lit up again. Mitchell calling. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. It tasted perfect. On the screen, Skylar knelt down and picked up the papers he had dropped. She stood back up, holding our marriage certificate in her hands. She read the document. She looked at Mitch, who was currently ignoring her existence as he frantically tried to call his wife for the third consecutive time. The young woman stood completely frozen in the center of the lobby, realizing for the very first time that the man who brought her here was not a separated man waiting for a divorce. He was an actively married man, standing in a hotel owned by the wife he was betraying. I turned my monitors off. I picked up my purse, my car keys, and my cell phone, which was currently ringing for the 9th time in 3 minutes. I walked out through the rear staff exit, completely bypassing the main lobby, and stepped into the warm afternoon air. The streets of Fredericksburg were crowded with tourists and the heavy, sweet smell of barbecue smoke. I climbed into my car and merged onto the highway, driving east toward Austin instead of going home. Kit needed me to sign one final batch of supplementary discovery documents before the courts opened on Monday. By the time I reached the Austin city limits, my phone had recorded 14 missed calls. An hour and a half later, I sat in Kit Underwood's empty conference room while she made photocopies down the hall. My phone buzzed on the glass table. It was a text message from Hector. I opened it immediately. Hector had written a purely clinical, professional report of the aftermath. After I left the building, Mitchell continued pacing the lobby and calling my phone for 20 solid minutes. Skylar had confronted him, holding the marriage certificate in his face and loudly stating that he had promised her he was already divorced. Mitch refused to answer her questions because he was too busy leaving desperate voicemails on my phone. Skylar finally snatched the plastic room keycard out of his hand, slammed it down onto the front desk, and walked out of the hotel. She left his overnight bag sitting on the floor, took her own purse, and drove away in her car without saying another word. Mitch was currently sitting completely alone in the honeymoon suite. He had ordered a bottle of whiskey from room service. I set my phone face down on the glass table. Skylar was gone. Mitch was drinking alone in a room decorated with white roses and chilled champagne. I had executed my plan flawlessly. I had total control of the narrative. But sitting in that cold conference room, I did not feel the massive wave of triumphant vindication I had been anticipating for 4 months. I just felt completely hollow. It was an echoing vast emptiness identical to the feeling of walking down a hotel corridor after all the guests have checked out and the cleaning staff has stripped the beds. The chaotic noise was gone, leaving nothing behind but a sanitized void. I left the law office late that evening, but I could not bring myself to drive back to the empty house in Dripping Springs. I had arranged for my children to spend the entire weekend at a friend's house. Instead of going home, I drove directly to my third property, a small 14-room boutique inn located in Wimberley. I unlocked the front doors myself and walked up the dark carpeted stairs to the second floor. I let myself into room number 6. It was completely empty. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat down on the edge of the large bed, running my hands over the crisp white cotton sheets that I had personally sourced from a textile supplier in Dallas. The room smelled of my signature lavender diffuser. I placed my phone on the nightstand. The screen was still on silent mode, but it lit up the dark corner of the room every few minutes like a steady warning beacon. 22 missed calls. While I sat staring at the ceiling, a new notification pushed its way onto the screen. It was a voicemail, but it was not from Mitchell. It was from a different number. I tapped the screen and pressed the speaker to my ear. Loretta's sweet, dripping Texas drawl filled the quiet room. "Jolene, this is Loretta. Mitchell just called me in an absolute panic. You need to understand that whatever you think you know right now, you do not have the entire picture. My son is a good man who works incredibly hard to provide for you. If he needed to find some private time occasionally, then it is only because you were simply not enough for him. You need to call your husband back right now and apologize before you do something you will deeply regret." I listened to the message twice. The first time a sharp spike of anger hit the back of my throat. The second time the analytical portion of my brain took complete control. Loretta had just left a recorded audio message legally confirming that she was fully aware of her son's private time. Under Texas law, recording a conversation is entirely legal as long as one party consents, and leaving a voicemail waives any expectation of privacy. I forwarded the audio file directly to Kit. 30 seconds later, a text message came back. "She just tied her own noose. Save that recording in 3 different places. Go to sleep, Jolene." I lay back against the pillows. The clock on the nightstand clicked forward. At exactly 17 minutes before midnight, the screen of my phone lit up one last time. Call number 31. Mitch did not leave a voicemail this time. He just let the phone ring until the carrier automatically disconnected the line. I lay alone in the dark, surrounded by the walls I had built and the sheets I had purchased. 31 missed calls in a single night. In 17 years of marriage, I could count on 2 hands the number of times my husband had ever called my phone to ask where I was or when I was coming home. He never cared where I spent my days, as long as dinner was hot and his clothes were clean. It took losing a $4 million empire for him to finally want to know exactly where I was hiding. I closed my eyes, letting the heavy scent of lavender pull me down into a dreamless sleep. Tomorrow morning, a process server was scheduled to knock on the door of the Honeymoon Suite. The real war was about to begin. The Sunday morning sun crawled across the kitchen floor in dripping springs, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the light, but the warmth did not reach me. I sat at the wooden breakfast bar with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. My phone sat face down on the granite counter, a silent witness to the carnage of the previous night. At exactly 9:12, the screen lit up, vibrating against the stone with a sharp, rhythmic buzz that made my heart jump against my ribs. I picked it up and saw Hector's name. My thumb swiped the screen with a trembling precision. "Miss Webb," Hector said, his voice coming through the speaker with a professional, unhurried cadence. The process server just left the second floor. He knocked on the door of the Honeymoon Suite precisely 2 minutes ago. "Mr. Calloway opened it. He was still wearing the blue polo shirt from yesterday, unpressed and stained. He had not shaved and his eyes were heavily bloodshot. I closed my eyes, picturing Mitch standing in that doorway, surrounded by the white roses and the empty whiskey bottle. He took the papers without saying a word. Hector continued the sound of the lobby fountain trickling in the background of his end of the line. The server gave the standard notification regarding the petition for divorce filed in Travis County. Mr. Calloway just stared at the floor and then closed the door. He looked smaller than he did yesterday. "Thank you, Hector," I whispered my throat, feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. "There is more," Hector added, and I heard the distinct click of his tongue. At 9:35, he came down to the lobby with his suitcase. He stopped at the desk. He asked me quite directly who the owner of this hotel was. "I followed your instructions." I told him your name. "Jolene Webb." I watched him stand there for 10 seconds perfectly still, as if he were trying to remember how to breathe. Then he pulled his suitcase out to the parking lot and drove away. I ended the call and let my head drop into my hands. 17 years of marriage had just ended with the sound of a suitcase rolling across a hardwood lobby floor. He was gone from my hotel, but I knew with a sinking certainty that he was not gone from my life. The war was no longer a secret Cold War fought with spreadsheets and hidden cameras. It was loud now. It was official. I looked around my kitchen. The copper pots hanging above the island, the custom cabinetry we had picked out together 5 years ago, the breakfast bar where Ren and Cass ate their cereal every morning, all of it was community property. We would have to fight over the square footage of our shared life. But my 3 hotels remained safe behind a wall of separate property law that he could never climb. My mother's legacy was the only thing that felt solid in a world that was currently dissolving into gray ash. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was in the laundry room, sorting a mountain of Ren's soccer jerseys and Cass's grass-stained jeans. I needed the mundane weight of the task to keep my mind from spinning. The scent of the lavender fabric softener filled the small space, competing with the rhythmic thrum of the washing machine. The doorbell rang a sharp, demanding sound that sliced through the house. I wiped my damp hands on my jeans and walked to the front door. I already knew who was standing on the porch. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, the smell of White Diamond's perfume hit me like a physical blow, thick and suffocating in the humid afternoon air. Loretta stood there in her Sunday best, a crisp navy floral dress she had likely worn to the morning service. Her frosted hair was perfectly in place, but her eyes were red and hard, flashing with a fury she usually kept hidden behind a veil of southern manners. Mitch stood behind her on the top step. He had changed into a fresh shirt at his mother's house, but the arrogance that usually defined his posture was gone. He looked cold, his jaw set in a hard, jagged line. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Loretta asked, stepping into my entryway before I could even offer an invitation. "Hello, Loretta," I said, stepping back to avoid the cloud of her perfume. "Please come in." Mitchell called me in a state I have never seen him in. Loretta continued, her voice rising with every word. She didn't sit down. She just stood in the center of my living room, her manicured fingers clutching her handbag so tight her knuckles were white. "He told me you sent legal papers to his hotel room. In front of strangers. Do you have any concept of how cruel and low that is, Jolene?" "I think the word you are looking for is public, Loretta," I replied, folding my arms across my chest. "And I find it interesting that you find a process server low, but you find bringing another woman into my hotel perfectly acceptable." Loretta's mouth pulled into a thin, bitter line. Mitch stepped forward, then his voice low and dangerous. "Joe." "Sit down," he commanded, gesturing toward the sofa. "We need to talk about this rationally." "Talk?" I asked, a dry, hollow laugh escaping me. "You called me 31 times last night, Mitch. I think you have had plenty of time to talk to yourself." "You are blowing this out of proportion," Mitch said, his salesman charm attempting to resurface through the cracks of his frustration. "Skylar is just a friend. Someone Mama introduced me to. She needed some help getting her feet under her after a bad breakup, and I was just being a gentleman." "A gentleman who books the Honeymoon Suite?" I asked, my voice dropping into a quiet, icy register. "A gentleman who uses community funds to pay for champagne and roses for his friend Loretta," moved, then shifting into a defensive posture I had seen her use 1,000 times before. "I did not introduce anyone to anyone for that purpose, Jolene. Nina asked me to help her daughter find some local connections because the poor girl was struggling. I was merely being neighborly." She took a step closer to me, her voice dropping into that sweet, poisonous drawl. "You have always looked for reasons to be the victim in this family. You have always been suspicious and cold. It is no wonder my son felt he had to seek out some warmth elsewhere. You have been a motel girl from Abilene since the day you walked into this house, and you have never quite managed to hide it." "I am hurting your son, Loretta," I asked, ignoring the insult about my past. "You provided the cabin. You left the light on for them. You even left the key on the patio table. I have the security footage of your beige Lincoln pulling into the gravel road exactly 30 minutes before they arrived. Every single time. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden. Loretta stared at me, her eyes widening as she realized the depth of the trap I had laid. For a brief second, the sweet mask fell completely away, revealing a raw, calculating look of shock. $4.2 million, I said, the number hanging in the air like a physical weight. "That is the current valuation of the hospitality group I built while you two were busy planning your little afternoons at the cabin. And every single brick of those buildings is under my maiden name." Mitch's jaw dropped. He looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger. $4 million. You have been hiding $4 million from me for 17 years. "I was protecting it, Mitch," I corrected him. "Because I knew that if you found out, you would have treated it exactly like you treated our joint savings. You would have spent it on whiskey and girlfriends and your mother's electric bills." Loretta found her voice then, though it was shrill and desperate. "I will find the most aggressive attorney in the state of Texas, Jolene. You will not see a single cent of Mitchell's hard-earned commission by the time I am through with you." You should be more worried about yourself, Loretta, I said, my voice as hard as the marble floors in Austin. My attorney has already issued a subpoena for your deposition. You will be testifying under oath about exactly what you knew and when you knew it. I would suggest you start looking for an attorney who specializes in perjury defense. The confrontation ended with the slam of the front door, leaving the house trembling in its wake. I stood in the entryway, the smell of white diamonds still clinging to the air like a stain. I walked to the window and watched Mitch's truck pull out of the driveway, Loretta sitting upright in the passenger seat, her chin held high even as her world began to crumble. I opened the window to let the fresh air in. Later that night, after Ren and Cass had returned from their friend's house and gone to bed, I retreated to the master bathroom. I locked the door and sat on the cold tile floor. The fluorescent lights above the vanity were harsh, highlighting every fine line on my face and the dark circles under my eyes. I had been a general for 4 months. I had been strategic, methodical, and perfectly controlled. I had looked at the security footage and the bank statements and the legal petitions as if they belonged to someone else's life. But now, in the silence of the empty bedroom, the strategic armor finally cracked. I pulled my knees to my chest and cried. I didn't sob loudly. 17 years of living under Loretta's judgmental eye had taught me how to keep my grief quiet. I cried for the 17 years I had spent being invisible. I cried for the woman I had become, a person who had to build an empire in the dark just to feel safe. The pain wasn't just about the infidelity. It was about the realization that I had shared a bed for nearly 2 decades with a man who never bothered to look at me. He didn't know I was a millionaire because he never asked what I did with my days. He didn't know my mother's insurance policy was large because he only cared about what I could do for him. I looked down at the Timex on my wrist. The crystal was scratched, but the mechanical ticking was steady and stubborn. My mother had cried on bathroom floors too. I remembered hearing her through the thin walls of our motel room in Abilene when I was 7 years old. She would cry at night, and in the morning she would pull her hair back, put on a smile, and go back to scrubbing the rooms. I wiped my face with a cold washcloth. I would cry tonight, but tomorrow I would get up. I had a business to run, a daughter to protect, and a legal war to finish. The invisible woman was gone, and the owner was taking her place. The heavy silence of the master bathroom seemed to pulse in time with the throbbing behind my eyes. I stayed on that cold tile floor for a long time, listening to the house settle, until the grief that had clawed its way out of me finally retreated back into the shadows. I stood up, my joints stiff and complaining, and splashed cold water on my face. The woman in the mirror looked fragile, but the woman beneath the skin was already reaching for her armor again. I knew I would not sleep, so I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, nursing a single cup of chamomile tea and watching the darkness outside the window turn to a bruised purple before the first sliver of the Texas sun cut across the horizon. To horizon. By 6:30 on Monday morning, I was moving through the motions of a life that no longer existed. I stood at the granite island, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the kitchen, and began packing a lunch for Cass. I spread peanut butter on whole wheat bread with a precision that felt almost surgical, my mind a dull roar of legal timelines and hotel occupancy rates. The smell of the coffee brewing in the corner was the only thing keeping me grounded in the present. It was a mundane task, a performance of motherhood that I had mastered over a decade ago, but today every movement felt heavy as if I were moving through water. Cass hurried down the stairs, his backpack thumping against his shoulders, and gave me a quick, distracted hug before grabbing his lunch bag and heading out to the bus stop. I watched him go, his youthful energy a sharp contrast to the stagnant air in the house. Then the floorboards creaked behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Ren. She didn't have her brother's morning bustle. She moved with a quiet, heavy caution that made the hair on my arms stand up. I turned as she stopped in the kitchen doorway. She wasn't wearing her school bag yet. She just stood there, her dark hair pulled back in a practical twist that mirrored my own, her eyes fixed on me with a weight that felt far too old for a 16-year-old girl. We stood in silence for a heartbeat, the only sound, the rhythmic ticking of the Timex on my wrist. "I know Dad has a girlfriend," Ren said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the typical teenage waver. She didn't ask it as a question. She stated it as an established law of the universe. I set my coffee mug down on the counter, the porcelain clicking softly against the stone. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. 2 months, she answered, finally moving into the room to sit on one of the tall bar stools. I saw him at the Dairy Queen in Fredericksburg. He was with her. She had blonde hair. He was holding her hand across the table. The image of my husband, the man who claimed to be at a sales conference sitting in a plastic booth and holding a girl's hand while my daughter watched from the parking lot, felt like a physical blow to my stomach. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, reaching out to touch her hand, but she pulled back slightly, her fingers tracing a vein in the granite. Who was I supposed to tell? She asked, her eyes finally meeting mine. If I told you, you would just cry, or you would leave him, and then the house would be gone. I didn't want to break our family. The realization that my daughter had spent 60 days carrying the weight of her father's betrayal just to protect me made the air in the kitchen feel thin. You've been carrying a very heavy load, Ren, I said. I wanted to tell her she was a child, and it wasn't her job to save us, but the look in her eyes told me she had stopped being a child the moment she saw him at that Dairy Queen. She nodded, her eyes red but remarkably dry. She had inherited my mother's stoicism, the ability to bleed internally while the world watched. Is he at Grandma's house? She asked. Yes, I told her. Did you kick him out? It is more complicated than that, I said, choosing my words with the care of a woman walking through a minefield. Your father and I are getting a divorce. He has been seeing someone else for a long time, and I have been preparing for this. You and Cass will stay here with me. Ren looked toward the window, the morning light catching the sharp line of her jaw. Does Grandma know? She asked. She knows, I replied. She helped him, didn't she? Ren's voice took on a bitter edge that I had never heard before. I saw her at the church picnic, Mom, 16 months ago. I saw her introduce that girl to Dad. I remember the way she was smiling like she was handing him a present. I felt the air leave my lungs. I had spent months tracing the origin of the affair back to that picnic, but my daughter had witnessed the seed being planted in real time. She had seen her grandmother orchestrate the destruction of her mother's marriage while I was in the basement washing dishes. I pulled her into an embrace then, and this time she didn't pull away. We stood there in the center of the kitchen, 2 generations of web women holding on to each other while the world we had known crumbled into dust. The Timex on my wrist ticked steady and loud between our heartbeats, a reminder that time moved forward even when you wanted it to stop. After I wrote a note for her school and watched her drive away, I sat at the empty breakfast bar. The house felt cavernous. My daughter had stayed silent for 2 months because she didn't want to break our home while the man who had built it with me was busy setting it on fire. I reached for my phone and dialed Kit Underwood. Kit, I said when she answered. Ren has known about the affair for 2 months. She saw them together in Fredericksburg, and she remembers Loretta introducing them at the church picnic 16 months ago. If Mitchell tries to fight for custody, Ren is going to testify. Kit was silent for a moment. Noted, she said. But Jolene, we are not going to use that girl as a weapon unless we absolutely have to. A judge will take her preference into account, but I want to keep her out of the crossfire if possible. I know, I said, looking at the empty chair where my daughter had just sat. I am not like him. I don't use people. By Tuesday, my focus shifted to the last remaining piece of the puzzle. I had the bank records, the hotel logs, and the security footage, but I still didn't know the identity of the person who had sent that first anonymous photograph to my post office box 4 months ago. It was the grain of sand that had started the entire landslide, and I needed to know whose hand had dropped it. I sat in my office at the web, reviewing the postmark on the original envelope. Fredericksburg. No return address. Standard white paper. I had asked Bridget to trace the credit card records for every office supply store in the area, but the results had been inconclusive. Then I began to think about who actually knew that post office box existed. I had opened it 17 years ago, and only a handful of people in the world had the address. I closed my eyes and reached back into my memory, sifting through the years Mitch had spent ignoring my mail. Then an image surfaced. 3 years ago, Loretta had been recovering from a minor hip surgery, and she had hired a local handyman and part-time driver to manage her errands. His name was Earl Jessup. He had worked for her for 11 years, a quiet, observant man who lived in a single-wide trailer outside of town. I remembered Loretta complaining once that Mitch had left a receipt for my post office box on the kitchen counter, and she had told Earl to take it to the recycling center along with her old newspapers. Earl had seen the name Jolene Webb on a post office box receipt, and 5 months ago Loretta had fired him. I drove out to the outskirts of Dripping Springs, past the manicured lawns and the gated communities, until the road turned to gravel and the trees grew thick and unkept. Earl's trailer sat at the end of a long, dusty drive guarded by a rusted truck and a small garden of wilted tomatoes. I stepped out of my car, the heat of the afternoon pressing against my neck, and walked up the rickety wooden steps. Earl opened the door before I could knock. He was a guyy man in his early 60s, his skin weathered by decades of Texas sun and his eyes heavy with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. Mr. Jessup, I am Jolene Calloway, I said. I know who you are, he replied, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. Your mother-in-law talked about you enough. Never had anything good to say. You sent me the photograph, didn't you? I asked. Earl didn't flinch. He leaned against the doorframe and spat into the dirt. I saw them at the cabin, he said. I was doing a final yard cleanup after she fired me. She accused me of stealing, you know. I took some leftover meat from her fridge for my daughter. She has the sugar, and we were short that week. Loretta called it theft. She called my girl trash. He looked out toward the trees, his jaw tight. I saw your husband standing there while she said it. He didn't say a word. He just stood there with that blonde girl and let his mother spit on a man who had worked for her for a decade. I remembered your name on that post office box receipt from years ago. I figured someone should know what kind of people they really were. I looked at this man, a man the Calloway family had discarded like a piece of trash, and realized he was the only person in Mitchell's circle who had possessed a shred of integrity. Thank you, Mr. Jessup, I said. You don't need to thank me, he replied, meeting my gaze with a sudden, sharp clarity. You just need to win. I drove back toward Fredericksburg on Wednesday, the highway stretching out like a ribbon of heat through the rolling hills. I rolled the windows down, letting the dry hill country air whip through the car, blowing away the scent of Loretta's perfume that seemed to linger in my pores. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need the noise. I was thinking about the milestones of my life. 25 years old, opening a secret post office box. 31, buying a ruined inn. 38, opening my third hotel. 42, filing for divorce. Every one of those moments had been spent in silence. I had celebrated my successes alone and carried my burdens without a hand to hold. I had built a $4 million empire because I was afraid of being small, but as I pulled into the parking lot of the Webb, that fear was gone. I walked through the front doors of the hotel, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the hardwood floor. I didn't go through the staff entrance. I walked right past the velvet armchairs and the wildflower arrangements through the lobby I had designed with my own sweat and mother's legacy. Hector looked up from the desk, his expression shifting from professional to a quiet, respectful warmth. Miss Webb, he said. Hector, I replied, walking past him into my office. I sat down at my desk and looked at the silver-framed photograph of my mother. I picked up my laptop and dialed Kit's office. I am ready for Loretta's deposition, I said, my voice sounding clearer than it had in months. Good, Kit replied. We have her scheduled for next week. And Kit, I added, looking at the door that led back to the lobby. When the dust settles on this, I want the signage on that door changed. It shouldn't say management anymore. I want it to say Jolene Webb owner. It is about time, Kit said with a rare, genuine smile in her voice. Yes, I replied, touching the scratched crystal of the Timex on my wrist. It is exactly the right time. The heavy silence of the conference room at Underwood and File felt like a physical weight pressing against the polished mahogany table that stretched between us. 3 weeks had passed since I delivered that white envelope at the check-in desk, and today the battle moved from the shadows of my hotel lobby into the harsh fluorescent light of a legal deposition. The room smelled of lemon furniture polish and the sharp metallic tang of the copy machine down the hall. A court reporter sat tucked into the corner, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine like a predator waiting to strike. Loretta Calloway walked into the room as if she were entering a Sunday morning church service. She wore a pristine navy floral dress, her frosted blonde hair sprayed into a rigid, immobile helmet. The suffocating cloud of her white diamonds perfume announced her arrival long before she took her seat. She touched the gold cross at her throat, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested she was doing us all a great favor by appearing. Mitch sat beside her looking gray and diminished his UT class ring, catching the light as he twisted it incessantly around his finger. Kit Underwood did not smile. She did not offer a greeting. She simply adjusted the microphone in the center of the table and began the recording. Mrs. Calloway, Kit said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that signaled the end of all Southern pleasantries. You are currently under oath. Do you understand the penalties for perjury in the state of Texas? Loretta offered a thin, brittle smile. I am a woman of God, dear. I have no reason to tell anything but the truth. Kit leaned forward, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a still frame from the security footage at my second property. The beige Lincoln was parked squarely in front of the Fredericksburg cabin. Loretta, do you recognize this vehicle? Loretta's manicured fingers tightened around her leather handbag. It is a very common car in this part of the state. Kit did not blink. This specific car with this specific license plate was recorded at this cabin 3 separate times over the last 6 months. Each time the driver, whom we have identified as you, arrived exactly 30 minutes before Mitchell Calloway and Skylar Novak. The footage shows you unlocking the door, turning on the porch lights, and leaving a spare key on the patio table. Kit paused, letting the silence ring. Why were you preparing a romantic retreat for your married son and his mistress? Loretta's face turned a mottled angry red. I was simply maintaining a family property. I had no idea who Mitchell was bringing there. Loretta Kit said, her voice hardening. We have the forensic accounting report. We have the records showing Mitchell paid the utility bills for that cabin from his commission account. We have the text logs from his prepaid phone. And we have your voicemail to Jolene, where you stated that if Mitchell needed time away, it was because she was not enough for him. She leaned in closer. I will ask you one more time. Did you introduce Skylar Novak to your son with the intent of facilitating an affair? The mask finally shattered. Loretta did not collapse. She simply turned into something sharp and ugly. The sweet Texas drawl vanished, replaced by a clipped, venomous tone that bit into the quiet of the room. I did what any mother would do, Loretta spat, her eyes darting toward me with a raw, naked contempt. I saw my son drowning in a marriage that offered him nothing. Jolene came from a motel in Abilene. Her mother scrubbed floors for strangers. She was never one of us. Mitchell deserved a woman from a proper family, someone like Skylar who understood our world. If I had to open a door to give him a chance at a real life, then I would do it 1,000 times over. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys, recording every hateful word. Kit sat back, a ghost of a victory appearing in the set of her shoulders. Thank you, Mrs. Calloway. We have no further questions for this witness. 2 weeks later, we stood in the Travis County Family Court for the final hearing. The courtroom was a cavernous space of dark wood and echoing footsteps. The judge, a woman with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen every trick in the book, reviewed the massive pile of documentation Kit and Bridget had assembled. Mitch's attorney tried to argue for an equal partnership, claiming that Mitch's hard work at the dealership had provided the stability I needed to build my business. Kit dismantled the argument in less than 5 minutes. She presented the evidence of my separate inheritance. She showed the 17 years of spotless records from my separate CPA. She proved that not a single dollar of community funds had ever touched Calloway Hospitality. The judge's ruling was swift and devastating. The 3 hotel properties valued at over $4 million were declared separate property entirely immune to division. I watched Mitch's face as the words landed. He turned to Loretta, who was sitting in the back row, and whispered loud enough for the entire room to hear, "You told me she had nothing." But the reckoning was not finished. The judge moved to the community assets. Because of the proven fault of adultery and the clear evidence of dissipation, she awarded me 62% of the community estate, including the house in Dripping Springs and the retirement accounts. The $67,000 Mitch had spent on Skylar was credited directly back to my share. When we walked out into the marble hallway after the hearing, I saw the final collapse of the Calloway family. Mitch was shouting at his mother, his face inches from hers. "You lied to me," Mitch yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You told me she was a motel girl with nothing. I lost $400,000 in there. I lost my house. I lost my kids. And you are the one who pushed me into it." Loretta stood there, her white diamond's perfume failing to hide the smell of her defeat. She tried to reach for his arm, her gold cross swinging, but Mitch shoved her hand away and walked toward the parking lot without looking back. Loretta was left standing alone in the center of the hallway, a woman who had spent 40 years performing a role that no longer had an audience. I walked past her, my heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm. I did not look back. I did not need to. 2 weeks later, I drove through the limestone gates of the Webb in Fredericksburg. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and the scent of wildflowers filled the air. I walked through the front doors not as a woman hiding a secret, but as the owner of the empire. Hector stood behind the reclaimed wood desk, a quiet smile on his face. Beside him, Wren was finishing a check-in for a young couple. She wore a tortoiseshell clip in her hair, and her eyes were bright and clear. She looked up and saw me, and for the first time in months, the weight was gone from her shoulders. I walked toward my office. The old plastic sign that had merely said management was gone. In its place was a polished brass plaque that caught the light. Jolene Webb, owner. I sat down at my desk and touched the silver frame of my mother's photograph. The Timex on my wrist ticked a slow, steady beat. The 16 months of shadows were over. The 17 years of invisibility were finished. I stood up, smoothed my white button-down shirt, and walked back out into the lobby. My daughter was waiting for me at the desk, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The sharp, rhythmic ticking of the Timex on my left wrist had become the heartbeat of my new life, a steady reminder that every second belonging to Jolene Webb was finally accounted for. I sat in the high-backed leather chair of my office at the Webb, watching the golden Texas sun dip below the limestone horizon, painting the hill country in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. On the corner of my desk sat a small leather-bound ledger that Mitchell had never known about, the true record of how a motel girl from Abilene built a sanctuary for women who had spent their lives being invisible. The idea for the spin-off surfaced not from a desire for more profit, but from the quiet, desperate letters I began receiving at my office once the local news broke about the Calloway divorce and the true owner of the hospitality group. These were stories from women in neighboring counties, women who stayed in marriages where their names were never on the deed, whose bank accounts were monitored like prison rations, and who had forgotten what it felt like to own a single piece of the world. I proposed a new track for Calloway hospitality, not just luxury suites for weekenders, but a residency program titled The Second Act. We would use the smaller 14-room property in Wimberley as a transition space for women who were standing exactly where I had stood 4 months ago in the dark, with a secret and a need for a plan. It was more than a room. It was a workshop for self-protection, offering access to forensic accountants like Bridget and legal minds like Kit, who understood that in Texas, a woman's best friend wasn't diamonds but a clean paper trail. This shift made the entire 17-year journey of hiding my inheritance feel purposeful, transforming my personal act of survival into a blueprint for others. I spent my evenings walking the halls of the Wimberley Inn, realizing that the greatest lesson I had learned wasn't how to catch a husband in a lie, but how to stop lying to myself about my own worth. My mother's Timex ticked against my skin, and for the first time I felt the weight of her struggle lifting, knowing that the $180,000 she left me was now funding 1,000 different beginnings. I stood at the front desk where Wren was currently training a new intern, a young woman who had arrived 2 weeks ago with nothing but a suitcase and a look of terrified determination. Wren showed her how to welcome a guest with a voice that carried the weight of the house, a voice that said she belonged exactly where she was standing. I watched them, my heart finally feeling full rather than hollow, and I realized that true revenge wasn't watching Mitchell and Loretta lose, it was watching these women find themselves. I turned toward the glass doors, seeing my own reflection as the owner of this empire, and I wondered how many others were listening to this story while sitting at a kitchen table that didn't feel like theirs. If you were standing in that lobby today, looking at the brass nameplate on my door, what would be the first secret you would finally let go of? And what is the one piece of yourself you are ready to reclaim before the sun sets on your own? First act. The steady mechanical ticking of the Timex watch against your wrist is more than just a rhythmic sound. It is the heartbeat of a woman who has finally reclaimed every second of her own life. You sit in the quiet sanctuary of an office you built with your own hands, watching the Texas sun dip below the limestone horizon, and you realize that the most dangerous thing a woman can ever be is invisible. For 17 years, you allowed yourself to be a shadow in your own home, believing that silence was a form of peace, and that making yourself small would keep the foundation of your family from cracking. You spent decades scrubbing floors and folding linens, pouring your identity into the comfort of a man who never bothered to learn the name of your business or the depth of your mind. The lesson etched into the brass plate on your door is that your worth is not a community asset to be managed by a husband or a mother-in-law. It is a separate property, a sacred inheritance from the women who came before you, and it must be protected with the same surgical precision you used to track every stolen dollar and every betrayed night. You have learned that self-protection is not the same thing as deception. When the world expects you to be a simple homemaker with no agency of your own building, your own empire in the dark is not a betrayal. It is an act of survival. You do not owe your success to those who viewed you as nothing more than a convenience, and you certainly do not owe an apology for having a plan when the people you trusted most were busy planning your replacement. This journey has taught you that true freedom does not come from the act of revenge itself, but from the moment you stop asking for permission to exist as yourself. You have transformed your mother's insurance policy into a legacy of independence, proving that a woman with a clean paper trail and a sharp mind is an unstoppable force. As you look at the young women in your lobby, you see the reflection of your own past, and you realize your purpose has shifted from merely surviving a marriage to funding 1,000 new beginnings for others who are still hiding in the shadows. You are the owner of your time, your wealth, and your future, and you no longer have to wait for the weekend or a sales conference to breathe your own air. Now, as you sit in the stillness of your own success, you have to wonder about the thousands of other women listening to the sound of your voice while sitting at kitchen tables that do not truly feel like theirs. If you were standing in this lobby today, looking at the name on the door and the strength in your own hands, what is the very first secret you would finally stop carrying for a man who does not deserve your silence? And what is the one piece of your identity you are ready to reclaim before the sun sets on your own first act?
Em có tài khoản Uncha Cek kita boy.